Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
Doing really well. How about you?
Pretty good. Owen?
Pretty good.
AJ?
AJ?
As good as good can be.
That's
Nice.
extremely good.
No, that's not. No, okay, see, your definition of good and my
Oh,
definition
alright,
of good
well,
changed the perspective on that, okay?
alright, and welcome to the debate. No, I'm just kidding.
And then this
Okay,
conversation went
Joke's on you. You thought this was a podcast? Nope.
Formal debate, or
Yeah.
actually informal debate, but you know. Alright, so are you guys ready to kind of learn and teach the reading of apocalyptic literature?
Go for it.
Absolutely.
No, not me go for it. That's not how that works.
I said let's go for it. Like, let us.
okay.
Like a conjunction. 2 words. Let us.
Well, we're going to address how apocalyptic literature is actually pretty difficult to read. By that, I mean it's literally the hardest to read in the entire Bible. By looking at a simple example, 1 or 2 verses, and it's Revelation 14. First 2 verses. And then we're going to kind of get a little bit of meaning from it, and then we're going to move on from there.
Can I read it?
You can.
Okay. Revelation 14:1. Do we want me to read 1 and 2 or just 1? I think we should just start with 1.
Yeah,
Because
do
1 is a whole load on its own. So Revelation 14:1. Then I looked. Okay,
Is
you know
this
what?
for us or are we recording this?
This is recording right now. This is literally our recording.
No cuts. We're not cutting this out. Revelation 14:1. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. So I
That's a
wonder
mouthful.
yeah, I was gonna say, I wonder what they're writing on the people's foreheads with. Is this like Sharpie or is this like
Oh, well, okay. Well,
Like-
that's totally the wrong
There goes,
question.
there goes
Like-
the symbolism
wash-
right out the
like-
window.
like Crayola washable marker? Like where are we going with this?
Okay, so let's try reading this in different, pretending like it's different styles each time. Okay, let's start with literal, like with what AJ's going with.
So if we look at this literally,
So John apparently opened his eyes, and he saw a sheep standing on a mountain named Zion.
a lamb.
Like this is actually happening. Like
Okay,
it happened.
can I point out though that the L in the word lamb is capitalized, so it's not just any lamb.
No, yes, completely. But I'm saying if we just read it
Oh, literally, yeah. Okay, then yep.
And apparently, this lamb had 144,000 people, and these people had they had the lamb's name and the lamb's father's name on their foreheads. That's an image. I'm not sure where John was going in the first century to see 144,000 people doing a lamb ritual on the with forehead. I'm not sure where that was at. But that's a huge historic event if it was. I don't remember it being recorded in any ancient text. But
Yeah,
he
I don't
saw
remember.
this. He says he saw this. So
I don't
mean,
remember that many people like standing in one place at once with the same mark on their forehead.
So just kind of giving an outline. What do you guys think this means? Because like obviously that's not actually literal, right?
Yeah,
It's like
there's no way. I mean,
Like
I would say possibly the number is literal just because there is a exact number.
well, there's an exact lamb.
Okay, but the
Not
lamb,
half
the L,
lamb.
no, but the L is capitalized, so we know that it's not just any lamb; it's the Lamb of God, Jesus.
Yeah, but also foreheads is a literal forehead. Apparently, if you go by the same thing, it's not like a.
It seems like the imagery is that. I'm not sure if the number is literal. I know that 144 is classified as a perfect number. Tell me if I'm wrong. So there's some sort of good or perfection here. Who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads, like they served them, like they were devoted to him and his father's. And when it says father's name, he's also referring. It's also foretelling that the lamb is Jesus, because it says his name, which is speaking about the lamb, and his father's name. So if it's talking about God, it's talking about the Father and Jesus in this. And if it's saying it has his name written on their foreheads, then it's probably symbolizing. I mean, I'm going off of a limb here. It's probably symbolizing that these 144 people, which I presume is a number of people.
144,000.
Yeah, yeah. Those people are following Jesus and God because they have their like how it talk later in Revelation about the number 666 being on like your forehead or your palm type thing. How it shows who they serve. Same thing here, but they're not serving the Satan.
Yeah, I would agree. Though I think we should go slowly through it to kind of make sure we know how to just so we would demonstrate a way how to read apocalyptic literature, then we'll break down what tools we use, kind of a thing. Okay?
Yeah,
So everything
right.
you said is right, but we can expand on it more.
Okay.
So we're going to start with the first thing. So I looked. That's actually extremely important in Revelation specifically. In other parts of Revelation, literally the next verse, he does two things in Revelation. John hears things and then he sees things. Currently, he's seeing 144,000. Do you remember anywhere else in the Bible where 144,000 is mentioned in Revelation, by the way, or an army?
Oh, an army.
Well,
The Battle of Armageddon.
You've got in verse. No, you have in Revelation 7. The literal heading is the 144,000 of Israel sealed.
Yeah, good job. Perfect. Like that's actually what we need. So what did John do? So in Revelation 7, like you said, Sarai, in verse 14, can someone read that verse slowly so we kind of
Like where in Revelation 7?
verse 4.
Verse 4? Okay, I'll read. And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. And then it goes on through all of the 12 tribes of Israel, and there's 12,000 from each that are said to be sealed.
So that's hugely important. He said, I heard the number of those sealed, right? And if you look in your Bible to Numbers chapter 1. Numbers is in the Torah. It's the fourth book of the Torah. It's called Numbers in English because, well, it's pretty a lame title for what happens in it, but there are military accounts of how many people in Israel, basically like recordings of the amount of soldiers they had, right? And it's exactly like what's happening here. They would list the amount of people in the army, and then they would list each amount of people from the different tribes, right? And it was often the same number, though some were off. But it did it a lot in Numbers, so that's why it's primarily called Numbers. But I think John is kind of hearkening back to that, as most biblical authors do, hearken back to the Torah. So with that in mind, John's hearing, what is he hearing?
Well, he's hearing the number, which I mean sounds kind of strange because when you think of such a big group, you're not like, oh, I heard the number. It's usually like, I saw this many people.
So yeah, he's using the word heard for a reason, right? So if in Numbers, right, whenever like this kind of thing is mentioned, which is the only other place in the Bible it mentions an army going to war and stuff, what will you think of when you hear John mention this? As in he heard this. What is he hearing?
He's hearing like the start of a war, I'd assume?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, like a military census. He's hearing
Yeah.
an army.
Okay.
The army, basically.
Yeah.
He's hearing the army rev up. So this is the army. These are the tribes of Israel, God's chosen people, as Sarai said. So this is God's army. This is like it's a little terrifying if you think about it. God's starting an army. That's pretty big.
Do you think the Satan has 666,666 men in his army?
All right. Well,
No, like actually, because no,
No.
because this number actually symbolizes something. It's not just a random
No,
number.
I absolutely agree. Yes, we will get to the 666 soon, but for this number, this is actually important. We should finish this one up. So we're only at if we go back to our first verse that we're looking at, Revelation 14, we've only started with I looked. So we went back to Revelation 7, and he saw I heard these numbers, this army, and here he's saying I saw a lamb. Which lambs were often used for sacrifices, as you all know. That's a common. I'm pretty sure most Christians understand that. What Jesus is mentioned as the lamb, that kind of thing. The sacrifice for sins, much in the Old Testament. And this lamb was standing on Mount Zion, which is not only a picture of what Israel and God is doing, but also more of where Eden is located. And with this lamb, there was 144,000. So this lamb had the same number as the people in Revelation 7, except it's not described as a fierce army. It's the army of a sheep. It's not something completely terrifying like John heard. This is what he saw. This is what's happening. Right, there we go. I got that right in.
Was that a voice crack?
Yes, it was. So John saw these the same number he did in Revelation 7, except they're described differently as he saw in Revelation 7. It's showing you the contrast between the two ways people think. The one that actually is real, which is what John saw, and then the way people think, which is what John heard. These aren't necessarily, like you said, Luke, perfect numbers. That's usually when a number is mentioned, the cop out to say, oh, it was just a perfect number for their culture. Well, that might be true. The Bible only mentions things that were previously mentioned in the Bible in some way. So like this is not necessarily just a perfect number. It's mentioned for a reason, and that's because in numbers it's trying to harken back to a military census, while the military clearly here is a bunch of people following a sheep, and they have the name of the sheep and his father on their foreheads. Just like you mentioned, how the mark of the beast was written on the hand and foreheads of the people, with the mark of the beast. Those two ideas of a mark on the forehead or on the hand is a symbol of the Shema prayer. Moses in Exodus, I believe, said, Deuteronomy. What am I saying? Of course, Deuteronomy. But he mentions the Shema, and then at the end of Moses mentioning the Shema, he said, "This shall be a mark on your forehand, or on your right hand, I believe it is, and on your forehead." So that's what John's mentioning here. He's mentioning that the name of the Father and the Lamb is going to be that close to them. It's going to be literally a part of their body. It's going to be their being, right? And if their name's on it, it's also hearkening back to the fact that these people are images of God, perfect images of God, right? They have the name of the Father and the Lamb. And I think the Lamb and the Father are, we don't need to go into those. I think everyone understands that. The Lamb is Jesus, and the Father is obviously God the Father, further explained in the New Testament. So I think that's that verse. Now we looked at one verse, and that's what we got from it. And there's a whole lot more verses in Revelation, let alone apocalyptic literature. And we kind of went slow there, and we approached that by already reading our Torah and kind of knowing it enough to kind of get what John is trying to say. So those are kind of the lessons, basically. We just went over a verse, and we took some ways in which we should read it. Now we're going to break those down. So does anyone want to mention something that we used to break that verse down?
Like literal tools, or like literary device tools?
Well, like in this verse, we did some things to figure out the meaning. It's like, what are examples?
Well, I mean, Blue Letter Bible. Oh,
Blue Letter Bible.
That's what I was asking.
We use symbolism and themes. We talked about like armies as a good like little small theme. We went back to the Old Testament and referenced some words that had meanings to it and applied it to these two verses or verse. We used the Torah, which is pretty good.
Torah. Gotta use your Torah.
Read your Torah.
I think that's the first thing that we should talk about. Your Torah. Someone open to a random part of apocalyptic literature right now, and then literally we'll go through it and mention Torah themes. Torah, you cannot read apocalyptic literature unless you have a decent understanding and a mind kind of being able to hearken back to Torah imagery. Torah is everything in apocalyptic literature. If you don't know Torah, you won't get apocalyptic literature. You can't just start the Bible by reading Revelation in the same way you can't just watch a movie series watching the last one. right? You have to kind of go through it to get the full understanding. Same here. If you want to understand apocalyptic literature, you gotta read Torah. When you're reading Revelation, you really gotta know Genesis, especially. Genesis is a big one. But yeah, do you have anything, Luke? Just some random spot of apocalyptic literature?
I do. It's in Hosea 9.
You just pick some random prophet, and then okay, Hosea 9.
Should I start off with the first verse, or should I just go to a verse that I enjoy?
Pick some whatever.
All right. Hosea 9, verse 13. Ephraim, as I have seen, was like a young palm planted in the meadow, but Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter. Give them, O Lord, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry beasts.
That's not beasts. That's breasts.
Breasts. Let's see. So it's talking about Ephraim, how when they were founded, when they were first found, in a sense, that they were like a young palm planted in a meadow, like a good thing, right? But now Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter, as if they've been unfaithful and they have gone down. And then it cuts to Hosea. It's kind of like a break, and it says, "Give them, O Lord, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts, as in that they will not multiply and they will die off, in a sense."
Okay, so give me some Torah imagery here. You broke it down, right. But I need some Torah imagery.
All right.
Because Torah is mentioned everywhere, especially the prophets. They love Torah.
Is it planted in the meadow, symbolizing like Eden?
Yes. Ephraim, as I've seen. So Ephraim, it was just a tribe of Israel.
Right.
Was close to God, basically. They were like Adam and Eve. You know, they were close to God. They were basically, with him, walking with him. Like Tyre, which we're in Hosea 13, by the way. Tyre is it's a word for rock, and that's actually was created in the creation. Remember the land, the rock. God is my rock. God is the land. Over the sea. It's firm. It's hard. So they were in Eden. They were firm. They were good, right? And then it goes on to contrast that to the next part of the verse, which says, "But Ephraim will bring out his children for slaughter." That's the complete opposite of what's supposed to happen in Eden. It's supposed to be you multiply, right? But that's not what's happening here. It's the complete opposite. God told the first humans to go out and multiply. He said that even to the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. But here, it's the complete opposite of what's happening. Just to show, Hosea is mentioning this just to show how bad it's really gotten. That they were here, and yet this is happening.
Yeah.
So does anyone want to go to another place where we can look up imagery? Literally just look up something random.
Job 7.
Job 7. If I'm being honest, I don't know if Job is technically a prophet.
I didn't know you meant specifically a prophet. You just said someplace random.
Sorry. No, I meant apocalyptic literature someplace random.
What about
Isaiah 53?
Go to Isaiah 53. We're going to go to Isaiah 53. It's just is it some random spot you just chose, AJ?
Yes, I've never read this before.
Isaiah 53. All right.
Okay.
All right. I'm not an idiot. Okay. Come on. Nope.
No, there is Isaiah 53.
My guy, Isaiah 53 is Spring Servant, the only Isaiah verse every Christian knows.
I don't actually know this one. I'm not even joking you.
Okay. Well, if you don't know Isaiah 53, I guess we'll just go for it because it's kind of big.
I was going to say neither do I.
See?
What, actually? Okay, wow. This is going to be huge for you guys then. All right, I'm going to read the first couple verses. Ready? Isaiah 53. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of Yahweh been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, plant, like a root of parched ground. He has no steady form, basically, or majesty, that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs. He himself has borne them, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquity, and the chastisement for our well-being fell upon him. And by his scourging, we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each has turned to his own path, but Yahweh has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. Do you see why every single Christian knows that now? It's literally
really,
word
but okay.
for word Jesus and his resurrection. This is when we talked about it in our gospel thing. We mentioned Isaiah because it was huge in the early Christian. It's talked about as the fifth gospel. This is literally Jesus mentioned, and I'm just going to go over and mention some themes just because this is apocalyptic literature. Verse 2 is an obvious one. So whenever something like this is mentioned, just you got to think some Genesis. He grew up before. So this is like this. There's this plant that's growing up, right? Just like a tree, just like an agricultural society would use these kind of symbols, right? Like a tender root out of parched ground. Parched ground is a kind of reference, I would say, to the Old Testament when Israel was in the wilderness with God. They were basically yelling at God to bring them water and that kind of thing. Parched. That's a kind of a general thing to look out for. So there's this plant that's going to grow up before, and this plant is going to be in parched ground, so in the wilderness kind of a thing. Think of why the gospel authors mentioned Jesus being in the wilderness for so long, kind of a reference to this. This plant will have no majesty, that anyone should look on him, nor an appearance that we should be attracted to him. Now, the word attracted is the same word actually used in Genesis. So remember when God made like the plants, this is Genesis 2, and he made all the trees and everything. In Genesis 2 verse 9 it says, out of the ground Yahweh God caused the ground to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight. So this tree is not going to be pleasing to the sight, just like the trees in Genesis were in Eden. This is going to be not like that. And yet this verse goes on to explain that this tree, which is later described as a person, which the Bible does a lot, by the way, is going to bear grief. So that's just kind of one way you can look at this verse. What did you guys kind of think of Isaiah 53, by the way? This is the whole thing, not just the apocalyptic part.
That's when you made it to the end of Isaiah 53, I started recognizing it a little bit more. It's just not something really like prominent that I've like heard a lot, honestly. And I think it's really cool, the connection you made from like that from Genesis, and then even taking that as like literal Old Testament prophecy of, okay, this is the coming of Christ. You can't say that this isn't entirely like you said, it's word for word. That's basically the story altogether.
It is. I found if you read people this and you're like, where's this in the Bible? They'll be like, oh, that's Jesus, right? That's the New Testament. And then you mentioned that it's Old Testament and it's almost 500 years. It's more than 500 years before Christ. Wow.
Yeah, no, this is crazy. This is definite prophecy. This is
Yes, absolutely. It's kind of crazy. So
yeah.
There you go. There's your there's things to look for. Eden imagery, specifically Torah. We looked at Torah stuff there.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone have any big? So we're gonna move on. We're gonna kind of segue into basically we're just gonna list out some symbols that you should look for that are hugely important. We're not going to go into their meaning too much. We're just going to list them so that when you're reading your Bible, you'll be inclined to realize that, okay, maybe I should look up the meaning of this or where else it's mentioned in the Bible to fully understand this. Does anyone have that list, by the way?
I like it. It's interesting. Like, I've never actually, to be honest, there are a lot of books of the Bible I have not read, which are just not good. But so Isaiah is definitely one of the ones that I have not fully read through, and Isaiah 53 I really like. I think is really interesting, and I think I'm gonna start using that a lot more now.
Absolutely.
Okay, so with our symbols of just stuff to look for that can be very important, we have a few things. We have time of day. There's a lot of times where like time is usually mentioned, like the 6th hour, something like that. We have time period. We have nations, different nations. Old Testament classical icons. We're talking about like Abraham, Moses being mentioned. And then we also have creatures, which is humans, human beings, spirit beings. Spirit beings are very important. And that is my list of symbols that I have.
That's perfect. So those are things you should look for. So when, like, I'm just going to give like a brief example. When it says like, when it mentions the time of the tribulation in Revelation, it says a time, and half a time. Hugely important. Please look in your Bible where those words are mentioned. Please. Massively important symbols. When it mentions an animal or a being or a spirit being, like you said, Sarai, hugely important. Please look up other places in which that's used. When it mentions nations, like you said, Sarai, it's hugely important. Like it mentions Babylon, that's one in Revelation. It's huge. Actually, it's pretty much almost used in every single apocalyptic literature. Same with Egypt. Those are hugely important. Those have connotations from the Torah. Again, can't stress that enough. You need to know Torah. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. Need to know it. What else did you say? You said Old Testament icons. Hugely important as well. Those are big for actually every book, specifically the New Testament, I would say. Like the gospel accounts, they use that a lot, like Moses and stuff like that. Those are extremely important as well. Does anyone have? Let's look at some big eye-catching things that you always notice whenever you're reading apocalyptic literature, but it's always strange when you don't understand the meaning. Does anyone have a list of those? I know you have it, AJ. The small symbols.
Oh,
the
yes.
The big ones. The big ones.
Big themes. Okay. Judgments and plagues, beasts, creation, New Eden. Creation, like new creations in New Eden, and Egypt and Babylon.
Thank you. Can you explain those a little bit?
No, because I can't. I literally cannot. I don't know how.
What do you mean?
I would if I could, I swear.
Oh, okay. Sarai, can you explain any of those?
I will try my best. Okay, so we have new creation. New creation is kind of, if we can go back to we can go into Genesis, obviously. Gardens was also another one that was mentioned. So the Garden of Eden. It's basically that's kind of a parallel. Not even kind of. It's definitely a parallel from there for creation. And all throughout Revelation, you're gonna notice beasts, kind of hard to pass over. In Revelations 13, you have the first beast that is mentioned. And it continues through a lot. So you have a lot of beasts all throughout Revelations. Plagues, self-explanatory. And obviously God's judgment that is seen all throughout Revelation of the final judgment being passed over the world, basically. Babylon and Egypt, I think Owen will do the best job explaining Babylon and Egypt. So, Owen, why don't you take that away, man?
Oh, great. All right, Babylon and Egypt. Okay, that's a big theme. It's actually used in almost every book of the Bible, I would say. Maybe not the small ones, obviously, like Ruth and stuff, but like the big ones. I think they're mentioned in Psalms a lot, that kind of thing. So in apocalyptic literature, they're mentioned a lot more than others because they're used as an archetype to describe what actually happened, the type of behavior that actually happened with those nations, which we read about in the Bible. So when we read Exodus, we read Egypt is this nation with a hard heart. They're this nation that has they enslave people. It's used as an image for a slave master. They're cruel. They dislike God. They hate God. And they're also a nation that has wrath poured out on them, specifically plagues. Babylon, it's similar but a little different. Babylon is a nation that hates God. It is used as the judgment for Israel, actually. Babylon is a nation full of sin, and it is described as another place of slavery, but mainly exile. So those are used all throughout apocalyptic literature. It mentions God will often reference these, or maybe the prophet will. These will always be referenced in apocalyptic literature as archetypes for how God will act or how God has acted. Example of that, I guess you could say, would be mainly Daniel. If you actually look almost everywhere in Daniel, because that's Babylon, right? So you kind of see it more and more in Daniel. The symbol progresses, but in Revelation 17 through 19, those chapters, huge verses about Babylon, like massive verses about Babylon. Those are going to be your go-to for Revelation, talking about Babylon. If you read those with keeping in mind that what kind of nation Babylon is and how it's used, specifically in Daniel, you'll understand it a whole lot more, that kind of thing. Those are kind of like huge themes to look for. They're also very obvious. So like plagues of Egypt, you'll notice those, right? Like the trumpets, the plagues of Egypt, like the trumpets, the bowls, the seals, huge themes, right? Everyone notices those. Then you got your beasts. Those are obvious. A beast comes out from the ocean. Whoa, like in like the verses that you mentioned, or the chapters that you mentioned, Sarai. And then new creation. That's more obvious in Revelation, I would say, with like the New Jerusalem and stuff. And then Babylon, which is a more obvious one, I would say. That's why I would categorize these four themes as big ones that everyone notices. Just make sure you're really looking into them. Babylon's obvious because it literally just mentions it by name. So those are kind of like big ones. You have some small themes as well that you won't often think about, but you'll just kind of glance over. Does anyone have the list of those?
All right. So little symbols would be kind of in their culture they were kind of like an how do you say it, Owen?
Agricultural.
Yeah, they were an
Agricultural.
They were an agricultural
There you go.
culture where they use symbolisms like trees, harvests, like plants, grapes, and things like that to explain certain things like good things, bad things, and such. This was all like basically in the Old Testament, and then they were also used in the New Testament too. You talked about plagues and judgment. Did we ever talk about beasts? I don't think we did.
I mentioned it briefly, but yeah, if you want to explain that, that'd be good.
Yeah. Trying to think what I can explain about it, Owen.
There is a verse that Sarai had said, if you don't mind me reading. Daniel 4:33, it says, "Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle. And his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws." So he's described like a beast. Exactly
in
like
a literal sense or in a symbolic sense, because I know that there's both sides to that.
Well,
That's
okay.
the tricky part about the beast is that you could define it as symbolic or literal, and that's the
The
hard
way
part.
the way he looks, the way it's describing how he looks is symbolic, but the way he was acting, he was actually eating grass. But it's interesting because he was acting like a beast, but like you were saying, that the beast can also be referred to someone who defiles God, which was really why that happened, was because he defied God.
Well, I would say, AJ, when you mentioned that he was actually eating grass in Genesis, which is just more reason why you should read your Genesis. The thing that is mentioned that the animals eat are it is I think it's the plants of the field. So when he's saying he's literally eating grass, I would say he's not literally eating grass. He's being described further as an animal, like in Genesis.
Okay.
But no, yeah, keep explaining.
No, that was basically it. Was it like the like how Luke was saying that being a beast was described as like defying God, and that's really what Nebuchadnezzar had done. Was he had taken his eyes away. In the next verse, Daniel 4:34 says, "But at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures for generation to generation."
Yeah, as soon as he acted more like a human, things
And stopped
went as
defying
they're
God,
supposed
yeah.
to.
So basically, as soon as he started actually glorifying God and doing what God wanted him to do, everything went back to normal. So, Genesis 37:33, it's talking about Joseph in this sense. It says, "Then he examined it and said, 'It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces.'" Now, if you remember, which I think it's later on, Ishmael is referenced in a certain way in the I think it's in the it's the Hebrew, right? That book, yeah. So the Hebrew that it's written in the story, when it talks about how Ishmael it basically calls him a donkey, meaning that he is going to be a baby. He's basically going to be against everyone. He even says that he's going to be against everyone, and everyone is going to be against him. Everyone is now against this beast that they think has killed Joseph, and that beast is now against everyone else.
You know how he talked about verse 33? Could you say in verse 34 how it went on? Well, is that even relevant?
What part are you mentioning?
Talking about the sackcloth and how that and
That's not a beast.
I know.
But I guess it could
It's
be
not a
related
bird.
to if Nebuchadnezzar put on sackcloth. But I don't know if he did or not.
I don't think he did. I was reading the verses. It doesn't say that he did.
If it helps, in Genesis 37:34, then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days.
There we go. Do you want to go off of that, Luke? Because that's the verse that I was talking about.
Oh, you're talking about 33.
No, I know, but 34 right after it talks about how that he put on sackcloth after
Yeah,
he found.
That's the verse I'm talking about.
You gonna go off that or?
But I don't know what to go off of. So I barely know what even sackcloth means. I had to look it up in Google Letter Bible, and I still don't understand.
Sackcloth means someone repented. Just think of that. That's literally it. It's not a huge theme. I mean, it's
It
used a lot.
says
It's
on
not...
Blue Letter Bible that it's the opposite of that. That someone is humiliated or is like laying down.
Exactly, humiliated. They've repented from their sins. They're humiliated for what they've done.
They are becoming humble, basically. They're humbling themselves in a way. That's what you could say.
I think we kind of beat the horse dead, if I'm being honest with that. Does anyone have the small themes that we could use for the things? The list of small themes?
I found a theme for apocalyptic literature, which would be trees. Trees are mentioned a lot in Genesis, a lot in Revelation, and a good amount through all the prophet books. I'm comparing a few Genesis verses to Hosea 9. It goes, "Ephraim is stricken, the root is dried up, they shall bear no fruit." Fruit is really consistent with trees. So say Genesis 1:11. "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which their seed according to each kind on the earth." It'll go Genesis 1:12. It talks about plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, the trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed. "They may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden." So trees and fruit are really not comparable, but they go together really well, and it's used as really good imagery to show a tree is bearing fruit, which is like good fruit. Fruit is also used with trees when it talks about fruit, when saying like they shall bear no fruit, like in verse 16 of Hosea 9. "The root is dried up, they shall bear no fruit. Even though they give birth, I will put their beloved children to death." So trees and fruit go together really well, I would say.
That's a good small theme that you won't often notice. Maybe the tree of life, which is mentioned in Revelation, you might notice a lot, but the overall tree imagery we looked at in Isaiah 53 how it was the Jesus, which obviously was Jesus mentioned in Isaiah 53, was mentioned as a tree. So that's a small theme that you might not notice, but you should always look up other places it's used in the Bible to kind of fully understand the verse. There are two more small themes that I would say that you should look for. These symbols are more turned toward Revelation, because that's the first thing Christians think of when they're reading apocalyptic literature. But there's actually a whole lot more in the prophets, but these are still mentioned. So the theme of harvest, actually Jesus uses that one a lot. Some cases in which that's appearing in apocalyptic literature would be Revelation 14, Isaiah 18, and Jeremiah 5. You kind of get the archetype for what it's talking about. Like if you want to look up other places mentioned in the Bible, a good place to look, I would say, would be Genesis 8, chapter 8, that is, and Genesis chapter 30. With that said, that's that harvest theme. Another small theme that I would say is really important is the army theme that we already kind of looked at with the 144,000 people sealed, the army census. That's in Revelation 7 and 14, as we saw. And a good place to look for those would be, for that kind of theme, would be Numbers 1 and Genesis 17:4. That's a big archetype for armies and how they kind of operate, how Jesus' thing is described as an army, but the army, how they act is they give their lives for others. That's the difference between how John hears and sees things that we looked at. So yeah, those are kind of generally the themes of the apocalyptic literature. This big and small themes, you should always look for other places in the Bible. I think we kind of laid it up for others to sort of, when they're reading their apocalyptic literature, which will definitely be difficult, this is some place they can look for things and kind of understand it better. So yeah, thank you all for really breaking down all those themes pretty intensely. One thing I just want to mention here is that's not all the apocalyptic literature people do. They don't just mention themes and stuff. They can mention allusions. They can mention all sorts of things. All sorts of literary devices. But those are the big ones because apocalyptic literature is largely symbolic, right? One apocalyptic literature uses, but not as often as other pieces might use, but they're still kind of important, are quotations. Like, oh, this was said here, and this was said here, like literally quoting a source in the Bible. That's an important one. That's used so that you go and read what that quoted verse is. And when you read it, you see what happens next in that whole passage. And then when you go back and read the book that was quoting it, you're like, oh, you expect something, and then the author will either further your expectation or contradict it. And so it really drives a big theme. So quotations are also something to look for. I would say those are easier to see than the others. Finally, I just kind of want to end off overall the theme of the whole how to kind of read, how to start understanding. This is not even near as in depth as we could have gone and as we should, but this is a good introduction to how to read apocalyptic literature. I cannot stress enough that Torah is the most important thing. You need Torah constantly. You can't read the end if you don't read the beginning, kind of a thing. That's generally how to read apocalyptic literature. Does anyone want to finish off with any thoughts about that kind of whole thing?
I think it's brilliant that there's so much imagery, symbolism, themes that are used to explain something so powerful and something so perfect. I think the brilliance of it is also perfect. So that's why I enjoy reading apocalyptic literature so much, is because of the symbolism, small themes, just the way they go about it. It's really cool.
All right. Yeah, absolutely agree with that. With that kind of said, I think this kind of ends off our overall general outline of how to read apocalyptic literature. Once again, it's not as in-depth as it could have been. This is just to kind of help us give an understanding. So when you're reading Genesis, you can look for themes now that might pop out to you. And you'll generally know where to look for the meaning of those by looking at other places used in the Bible. A good tool to do that, just an easy one, free, if you just want to look up something, is you can get the free Logos software, which is really good. Or you can get, there's a website called Blue Letter Bible, which is also pretty good. You can just look up a word that's used in the Bible, and it will come up with the word and words used in the Bible. That's an easy way to kind of figure out the meaning of something, especially weird ones like, harvest and stuff. Yeah, that's basically the general way to read Apocalyptic literature. With that said, I think we're kind of done with it. All right, you all ready to stay tuned next time? Please unmute. There you go. Like, you ready?
Yep.
All right, someone count down.
On three.
3.
1, 2, 3. Tune in
Tune in
next time.
Next time.
It gets better every time.
Your kingdom come, your will be done. Let your kingdom come, your will be done.